Hi guys, and welcome to week 10 where we're going to go over periodization and planning for athletes and teams. So there's three main categories we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the principles of periodization, which is elements we've covered already in terms of adaptation theory. So we're going to go over that. We're going to look at the three main types of periodization, create some categories and framework around that. We'll have a quick look at sports demand analysis and what's involved, and I guess what are the more important things to focus on in our setting, and what's basically enough information to collect before we're ready to implement. And then we're going to have a look at the planning process, where we're going to look at specific training phases, design and implementation of those phases, considerations we need to make, and some practical examples as well. And what I want to get our head around today is that whilst periodization is really a big component of where we start with a lot of our stuff, it is just that, it is a plan, and it really is going to set the framework for where we want to go with our guys. So why periodize or why plan? Well, it's a strategic approach to promote long-term training and performance improvements with pre-planned systematic variations in training, volume, intensity, and specificity in organised periods within an overall program. There are four main things we're trying to look at. We're trying to produce optimal performance at a desired time. So looking at different events or competitions and making sure that we're peaking for those events. Incorporating training interventions to target specific physiological and performance outcomes, so identifying certain goals or things we're trying to achieve, and then making sure that we can properly plan training progressions to get those physical adaptations. We use it as a management of training stressor to reduce potential overtraining, so making sure that training loads are not spiking beyond ideal or beyond what's doing enough to adapt a physical stimulus for us. We also use it to promote long-term athlete development. So when we're looking at trying to work with athletes over an extended period of time, we want to make sure we're training with purpose and with a long-term vision of what athlete we're trying to build. Essentially, training variation should be applied in a logical, systematic approach in order to establish training response whilst decreasing fatigue, increasing performance within certain periods of time. So just looking at some of the adaptation theories we've talked about previously. So obviously we've covered GAS, or general adaptation syndrome, which has our four-phase approach, which is our alarm phase, our resistance phase, our supercompensation phase, and our overtraining phase. What we're trying to make sure is that we don't achieve the overtraining phase. So alarm phase is our stressor, that's our training. Resistance phase is our recovery, where we are going through fatigue, and then supercompensation is the adaptation process taking place. Now, what we need to consider is when we are planning and programming that we're applying a sufficient enough adaptation stimulus. So if you look at the dotted line, we can see in the first example that is titled not sufficient enough, that dotted line is decreasing over time, which is suggesting that the stimulus that we're programming or applying is not appropriate. So that would require a review of the training stimulus and an assessment of what would be more appropriate to contain a more progressive stimulus going forward. The second one, we've seen optimal stimulus is achieved. So we can see that similar to the GAS chart, there's a training stimulus, there's a drop-off, and then there's a supercompensation occurs. And then as we repeat that cycle, the supercompensation increases greater over time, which is showing a nice linear progression. So that's a really nice management. So we could suggest that the stimulus of training response is really good there. Then we have the overtraining phase. Whilst we are getting the similar to the GAS, we are getting over a period of time, that dotted line is not changing. So the stimulus is not progressive despite it increasing and decreasing. Over time, it's not continuing to progress in a positive linear direction. So further to the general adaptation syndrome, that's a little bit more specific to sports and training environment, is stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation theory. So essentially what we're looking for here is creating a stimulus through stress, the body receiving a fatigue response to that, then a recovery taking place, and then allowing for adaptation to occur. So this is the general response after a training stimulus is applied. The initial response from a training stressor is an accumulation of fatigue, which creates just both a reduction of both preparedness and performance. As fatigue begins to dissipate, the recovery process is then initiated, and as a result of this, preparedness and performance increases. And then finally, a new training stimulus is required to continue to overload the system. Okay, so quite a simple concept and quite logical way of thinking about how the body stresses and adapts to training. And further to this, as some of you might have heard of the fitness fatigue theory. Essentially, it's a paradigm partially explaining the relationship between fitness and fatigue. These are the two after effects of training, so fitness and fatigue summate and influence preparedness of the athlete. The theory suggests that there is little to no benefit to train beyond the stimulus of fitness in order to seek more fatigue. And you can see it simply in sort of the basic equation flowchart below, is that we have our training competition and load, and that creates both fitness capacity and also fatigue. And the performance that we're left with is the fitness capacity minus the fatigue. So once we've achieved what we need to get a fitness response or increase in capacity response, that is essentially when we need to stop, because any accumulation of fatigue during that time is just going to fog the development of fitness and capacity and essentially influence that performance in a negative sense. So moving on to the types of periodization. So there are three main types that we look at, and that's traditional, non-traditional, and block training. And so with these, if you might have heard other phrases as well, they'll generally fall into either traditional or non-traditional. And what you can see in this table here is just a breakdown of the training phases that we have within those periodization models. And they can be generally broken down to the preparatory, competitive, and transitional phases. And you can see the monocycle represents one, the bicycle would be 2 cycles within the 1 year, and then the tricycle would be 3 cycles. And as a result, those preparatory, competitive, and transition phases are broken up accordingly. So a monocycle would be really appropriate for someone who has 1 season per year. A bicycle might be a dual sport athlete, or 2 seasons per year, and a tricycle structure might be more appropriate for people who have certain events they need to peak and taper for. So looking at traditional periodization involves moving from high volume, low intensity to low volume, high intensity in a linear fashion. It's often referred to as linear periodization, and probably the most basic, general, progressive overload concepts of periodization models that exist. It's really useful for beginners and developing athletes because it gives us really clear and concise progression patterns, and it's really simple to train multiple elements at the same time. It's also really appropriate for off-season and pre-season training when there's little influence of game and the chaotic nature of events and sporting calendars. So when we have blocks and periods of time, it can be a really effective way to then build those qualities on top of each other. You can see in the loading scheme on the bottom right, we have the hypertrophy leading into maximal strength, explosive strength, maximal power, and then peaking. And that's really nice progression of training elements as we move forward. Naturally, as a result, hypertrophy is going to be the more volume-based training and generally speaking, the lowest intensity, whilst our maximal power or peaking is going to be the lowest volume, highest intensity. So looking at non-traditional periodization, it essentially involves creating a sequence of wave dosages of volume and intensity. So now we're looking at sort of changing the variation of stimulus to make sure that whilst we're always training one thing, something else is always recovering. It's concentrated loading of many qualities within a given mesocycle. So as I mentioned, we can train different qualities throughout. Its variations include a wave-loaded, undulated, nonlinear, or conjugate, are other names you might have heard associated with non-traditional periodization. And it essentially means it just doesn't have a linear relationship between volume and intensity. We can have weekly or daily workload undulation. And we can also what we also want to do is make sure it's appropriate for developed athletes and in-season periods. So for athletes that are beyond that developing phase, a little bit more specificity and management of load and intensities becomes a little bit more important. And also in-season periods, it allows us to continue to maintain physical qualities at a high level by ensuring we're always training something hard and then always letting something recover. We're never more than a week away from training that stimulus to a high level again. It allows us to have a great exposure to the athlete as well. So we're exposing them to a high variety of training stimulus, so then they stay prepared for it should they have to face it again. So there's a few methods to structure undulation models, and that includes monthly or bi-weekly undulation. So I'll use an example later on where we use a bi-weekly undulation with our with the umpires. You can also use weekly undulation, and then also daily undulation, where each day is slightly changing the specificity and intensity and volume of training, which is something we commonly use in season strength training. And then we have block periodization. Block periodization is not something we have to worry about too much, and it's something that we don't want to get too involved in. It's really quite specific for high-level athletes, and particularly those that have singular events. So it originally come from the Eastern European countries, in particular Soviets, who use it a lot in their athletics, track and field, in particular their field events. And they would use the transmutation of different qualities on top of each other and using the residual training effect to improve the quality of each one. So it's characterized by concentration dosages. and it takes advantage of the residual training effect. Its emphasis is on training one quality at a time, and each stage is categorized by 3 mesocycle training blocks, and that is accumulation, transmutation, and realization. So the thought process here in the highly developed athlete is that you want to maximize the development of one quality and then use the residual training effect to continue to train the next quality within the sequence, understanding how long the previous quality will remain readily available in, I guess, a form of adaptation to the body. So the 3 phases for block periodization include accumulation, transmutation, and realization. So the accumulation is generally a work capacity block where you're building basic abilities and qualities. Transmutation is the sport-specific application of those work capacities, so starting to move more in the nature of sport. And then realization is generally the performance window. You can see a guideline for the duration and the particularities as well, which involve a little bit more detail in terms of how we use those qualities. As I mentioned again, this is really for a high-level athlete who's already adapted to the stresses of linear and non-linear periodization. The simplest thought process with periodization is if linear is working or traditional is working, it doesn't need to be changed. Then you can look at wave-loaded or non-traditional. And then once the athlete is adapted to those stimulus, then you can look at block. Block is much more aggressive, so we need to be mindful of that when training the athlete. So there's a few indications here to understand the sort of residual training effect. So it basically suggests that aerobic endurance will have 30 days of residual training effect with a plus minus of 5, maximal strength 30 plus minus 5, and you can see so on between anaerobic glycolytics, strength endurance, and maximal speed. And so it's important to understand that when we're training these qualities, that's how long that training element will be available for as we move through those 3 phases. As I said, you can start to understand the detail. Block periodization is really quite advanced. So to worry about this with a developing athlete would just be blasphemy and completely unnecessary. And it really is for the highly developed athlete. And I really want to iterate that so we don't need to worry about block periodization too much. To give you a bit of a visual, you can see the accumulation, transmutation, and realization phase. And what you want to make sure is that at each phase throughout the off-season, pre-season, and in-season is that they're peaking for a specific event. In this case, it's been identified the training camp, season opener, post-season, and off-season. Okay, so a nice visual representation of what those 3 phases look like. And again, your accumulation, depending on how big those stages are, is that 2 to 3 week. Transmutation is again that accumulation 2 to 6 week, transmutation 2 to 3, and then that realization is that little peaking window. All right, so looking at the sports demand analysis. So basically this involves the process of analyzing the physiological demands of a sport, inclusive of set environments, rules, regulations, and parameters. So it's really important to understand, one, the physiological things, and 2, the constraints that the sport is played under to give us an understanding of what we actually need to develop the athlete towards. It involves evaluation of general and physical demands, structure, duration, rules, and conditions of the sport, look at work to rest ratios. You can use time motion analysis and movement analysis, so assessing main movement patterns, development of common injuries and research into those areas, and also looking at variables, so positions, irregular rules that occur, and potentially conditions if it's an outdoor sport in particular. So a little example of how we look at this, and this is a really simple, and you can really constrain this however you like. Basically what it is it's a scale measurement of 1 to 10 to assess each key physical quality, and that's a subjective assessment where we're trying to essentially visualize from our assessment of the sport what we perceive to be of stress to the athlete. We look at what sports characteristics are involved. So is it a team sport? Is it individual? Is it in the water, on land, indoors, those sorts of things. We need to look at the length of the competition, so the time of the actual competition. Looking at work to rest ratios, so how long are they working for, how long are they resting for, which is fantastically, and to an extent now we can use GPS quite easily to look at that a little bit more in depth, to understand how aerobic and anaerobic it is, how much high speed running they're doing, how much threshold running they're doing, that sort of stuff. We want to look at the distribution of intensity of effort, so how often are they doing maximal efforts. And then we want to develop a little bit more information around common injuries, movement patterns, and other key elements of research that might have come up. So again, this isn't the one you have to use for source demand analysis, but it's a nice framework to look at both subjective and objective measures to draw some more information about the sport. The main goal is to self-educate yourself on the sport. It's very common for us to get athletes of sports that we might not be experts in, and nor should we be expected to be experts in. And it's not necessarily that we then need to go super sports specific with how we train the athlete, but to be mindful of the physical demands they face, it's important to have context. So if you have, a lower body dominant athlete, like a snowboarder or something, you're probably not going to want to be, focusing 80% of your program on upper body. And so it's simply just a tool that we can start to use to break down how much we need to be focusing on with those particular athletes in certain areas of their training. Some of the practical implications include energy system demands and how we're going to program that, the priority of fitness versus skills, qualities, and relevant time spent training each quality. So understanding how much time they're investing in skill development, understanding the culture and nature of the sport. So, what political things are at play, how does the progression through the levels work? Are there ranking points involved where people have to achieve certain levels? For some athletes, it's a matter of being available for competition, because simply the more they can compete in, the more ranking points they can accumulate, and therefore the easier it is to then compete at a higher level. So understanding all these elements are really important. And then fundamentally understanding the likelihood of where injuries may occur. So understanding high-risk areas to the body. Obviously, football, we know that things like high-speed running, hamstrings, ACLs, shoulder injuries from contact are really important. You look at something like surfing with the increase in aerial tricks and stuff. Now, knee and ankle stability is becoming a huge part in terms of absorbing force. So understanding where these risk factors are at and developing that information will go a long way to really helping you make sure you're putting together a really strong program and plan for the athletes. So one of the last things we want to look at is just the training phases. So this is a nice chart just to give you an understanding and terminology of what we look for. So we've got our multi-year plans, which is 2 to 4 years, which might be for some of our Olympic-based athletes to have that long-term outlook. Annual training plans where we work around most athletes, so that's generally the 1 month period, also referred to as a macro cycle, so multiple months to a year. If we've got athletes that compete in certain events, then it's generally a macro cycle, which looks at time between events. So if it's 6 months between events, then we'll plan, sort of a biannual macro cycle. Mesocycles is where we live a lot in terms of strength and conditioning side of things. So a lot of our strength and conditioning plans will be based off mesocycles. And then our microcycle is what's that look like over a week. So how are we breaking up and train different qualities and different focuses on different days. Then obviously our training day, if you've got double days, then you're going to have to start thinking about what you're doing in the AM and the PM, and obviously your training session. So for most of our guys, it's annual plan, mesocycle, microcycle, and training day are the key things we look at. So this is an annual plan I've got here, quite detailed, just looking at the breakdown of a swimmer. So this can be applied to anyone that has event-based training. So you can see we want to establish the dates and the weeks, and that will give us the framework for what we want to take as all the eliminating factors. So the first thing we enter is all the competitions and all the important stuff, so we understand how many periods of time blocks we can increase our training into. Then we want to identify, well, where does the season start, where does it end, where are the most important things that we need to prepare for, and that will dictate where our preparatory, competitive, and tapering phases occur. From that, we need to develop, what are we trying to develop in these phases? So if it's preparatory, we might be trying to look at development qualities. If it's competition, it might be more maintenance or rejuvenation. And if it's taper, it's definitely going to be more of that rejuvenation phase. Then we need to look at how long are these durations going to last for. So if we've got 8 weeks, how are we going to break that up into mesocycles? Probably looking at like a 4-4-2, where you might get 4 weeks developmental preparatory, 4 weeks competition, 2 weeks taper would be a pretty, 4-3-1. So 3 weeks and then allowing 1 week taper. So then we break that down. Then we identify some clear goals of what we want to work on in terms of what that looks like training-wise, what physical qualities we try and develop in those windows. And then we're going to look at sort of the methods, and that's going to really help us to plan what we're trying to do. So thinking about the exercises that we want to include in that. Very similar, this is a team-based one. So this is the one I use with the umpires. What you can see here is that our loading is really important. So obviously we plug in our season. So it's really identifiable where our pre-season competitive peaking phase is and off-season is. And what we want to make sure is that we're providing appropriate stimulus during that phase. So what we see is in the pre-season is a consistent load, deload approach, whereas in season it's more of a maintenance approach, and you can see that with the orange and yellow, and not so much of the shock or overload weeks. What we do then have is we have an indication for how we're breaking down our quality. So there's three key things we work on, and that is our strength development, our running capacity work or our energy system development, and then we have our technical element or our neuromuscular element. So they're the three qualities that we're really focused on as a group setting, and then we can see the periodization across. So at the start, the off season, the guys get a fair bit of time off, and then we move to very basic strength endurance work. And for these guys, it's really strength maintenance in season. So we just reduce that volume. With the running mechanics, with the running intensity work, we're looking more at building that aero capacity in the off season, carrying that through in more high intensity aerobic work in the pre-season, building into more anaerobic work in season. So it's just an increase in intensity there. And then our technical elements is a high exposure in the off season to a more intensive specific focus in season with no major changes. And the main thing for that is that because for these guys, circumstantially, they don't have a high variation from times of season. So we need to make sure that exposure is really consistent and maintained to a high level. So that's our key focus. So slightly different variations in terms of how we plan, but structurally very similar. We're looking at mesocycle. This is again an example from the umpires. So again, those key three elements we're looking for is the neuromuscular element, the conditioning element, and strength element. Now, for argument's sake here is that our program doesn't give us high access to strength development. So it's all done on an individual needs basis. The main things that we do have control over are the speed, change of direction, and conditioning work. So you can see in this model here across this mesocycle, 4 weeks, we can see there's an undulating approach. Weeks 1 and 3 are more volume-based weeks, whilst weeks 2 and 4 are more intensity-based weeks. And as a result, the drills reflect that. So in the extensive volume-based weeks, our neuromuscular drills, slightly more volume, slightly lower intensity. And then in our intensive weeks, we move to reactive work and higher intensity work with higher intensity running with longer rest recovery. Now, looking at a microcycle, I've just given 2 examples here to give you an exercise breakdown. Not too much different here. We can see sort of week 1 is the more extensive, a little bit more volume. Not a huge change in terms of week 2 for our linear day, which is the Tuesday. But on the Thursday, as we move to the reactive drills, we go from performing basic rudimentary change of direction, organized exercises, to then dynamic reactive work. And then we also have our conditioning breakdown. So the main thing to look for here, if you look at the Tuesday session, we have 2-minute efforts at 95% MAS with 2 minutes rest, so working a 1-to-1 recovery. And then the following week, we have 4 600 meters. So the 600 meters in 2 minutes is very similar for our umpires. What we tend to find is that they'll do that in 2 minutes, which gives them 3 minutes recovery. So if they're feeling good, it allows them to run at a higher intensity. With our MAS for the Thursday session, which involves change direction, the main variation is we increase the intensity by 5%, but we increase the total volume, decrease the volume by 3 minutes. So it's a really nice interplay there. But that's our microcycle. It gives us a breakdown of all the exercises we do, what's involved in the session from a neuromuscular development perspective, from a conditioning perspective, and then obviously the strength is separate. Game day is obviously the demands of games, so that's specifically individual, and they'll be doing sort of 15 to 17 kilometers a game. So some of the main takeaways is have a plan. Understand there's no perfect periodization model. Analyze and educate yourself on individuals and sport-specific variables. Not planning is coaching blind. And always relate it back to the athlete's situation. One thing I want to finish on is that human variability is always the biggest factor. So don't be a slave to your program or plan. If an athlete comes in and they're a little bit off and you have some heavy session planned, it's important to adapt your program to suit that athlete in that environment, because the human will adapt to not what's on paper, but what they put their body through. And it's up to us to make sure we put them through what's the most appropriate thing for them on the day. So we have our plan, it dictates and provides us a guide, but then we use our coaching nous and skill set to make the best decision in the moment. So hopefully you got a couple of things out of that, guys. Create some good framework around the different periodization models and insight to some of those examples across our macro micro cycles. I'll have some more examples we can go over in detail in terms of how we look at speed, change of direction, conditioning, and strength training in different approaches. And then we always want to remember, it is our plan, it is our guide. Make good decisions, and it will help your athletes go a long way.